Good afternoon. As our nation is filled with controversy over Israel's invasion of Gaza and the immense suffering that it has caused, I'd like to suggest a new way to view this conflict. It is a perspective that can guide us not only in this particular situation, but in many other troubles around the world. For example, there's anarchy in Haiti, there's drought and famine in the Horn of Africa, there's the ongoing war in Ukraine. The list goes on and on. About a month ago, we had a guest speaker at our church who was a former mission worker in Peru. And in his sermon, he talked about an interesting feature in the local Quechua language. He told us that there are two words for we. The first word is a we that does not include the person you're talking to. For example, you're chatting with a friend about your family vacation and you say, "We are going to the beach." That does not mean you're taking your friend with you. The second Quechuan we is one that includes the person you're talking to. For example, you're at a picnic and you see storm clouds on the horizon and you tell someone, "We're going to get drenched." That we includes the person you're talking to. Now, the mission worker noted something interesting about the Quechua translation of the Bible. Their version of the Bible almost always uses the second form of we, the inclusive we that forms a bond between the speaker and the person they're talking to. So, what would happen if we use this word to understand what's happening in Gaza? First, we'd have to move away from the word that we seem to prefer, them. Them makes this point of separating us from the people that we're talking about. It keeps them at arm's length. Oh, sure, we may care about them. We may think what they're going through is important, but it doesn't affect us because them, by definition, does not include us. But what if instead we use the word we? And not just the regular old English we, but the Quechuan we that affirms a bond and a connection between everyone. If we use this word, we'll recognize that the Israelis and the Palestinians are not separate groups. They're not separate from each other, and they're not separate from us. We are all part of we. We are all part of us. And this could lead us to say things like, we were killed and terrorized by Hamas on October 7th. We have had hundreds of rockets fired on us. We have been bombed and starved and forced to flee from one bad place to another. We are hostages being held in horrific conditions, even if we're still alive. We are wounded children with no medical care available to help us. We are international aid workers risking our lives to help those in need. We are Israeli soldiers. We are Hamas fighters. We are the perpetrators of great suffering on both sides. And we are the victims of great suffering on both sides. I could go on, but I imagine that by now you get the point. There is no us or them. There is only we and us. Now, applying this understanding of we is not just something from a local Peruvian language. This understanding of we is thoroughly biblical. The Bible emphasizes that we do not separate ourselves from one another, but that we belong to each other. Romans chapter 12:15 puts it very simply. Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. We are called to share the best and the worst that life has to offer with one another. And speaking of one another, the New Testament is littered with references on how we are to treat one another. In other words, how we are to treat the other people in the we that we are part of. The New Testament tells us that we are to be devoted to one another, to honor one another above ourselves, to live in harmony with one another, not to pass judgment on one another, to accept one another, to instruct one another, to greet one another. We hear that one 4 times. To seek to agree with one another, to encourage one another. That one shows up 5 times. To serve one another, to bear with one another patiently, to be kind and compassionate to one another, to submit to one another, to forgive one another, to teach and admonish one another, to spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not to slander one another, not to grumble against one another, to offer hospitality to one another, to be humble toward one another. But especially, the Bible tells us to love one another. That shows up 11 times in the New Testament. And loving one another is perhaps the root that motivates us to do all of the rest of the one another's. Now, the biggest challenge here is perhaps the most ironic of all. As you are hearing me talk about all the things we are to do for and with one another, you may have been tempted to think, yeah, if only they would act this way. Remember, the they who are not living out all of these one another's are us. They are us. Now, if you were expecting me to outline a possible resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or to pick a side in the conflict, I'm sorry to disappoint you. What I do have to offer instead is an attitude and a perspective to help us sort through such a difficult and heartbreaking situation, along with many other situations that are equally heartbreaking, but maybe don't get as much attention in the news. Would you pray with me, please? Lord, teach us that we are we, that you do not look upon us as separate from one another, but that we are joined to one another, regardless of our background, regardless of what we do, regardless of where we live. Teach us, Lord, how to live with one another and how to love one another, especially in the situations in which division and conflict seem so harsh and so brutal. Amen. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk again later.